At 0847 on the morning of April 7th, 1943, First Lieutenant James Swett pushed his F4F Wildcat into a screaming dive over the Russell Islands. Watching 150 Japanese aircraft swarm toward the American fleet below. 22 years old, a California kid who had learned to fly in civilian flight schools, his first aerial combat mission. The Japanese had launched their largest air offensive since Pearl Harbor. They called it Operation IGO, a massive coordinated strike designed to destroy American shipping and break the back of the Guadalcanal campaign. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself had planned the attack. Swett's position was at the end of a four-plane division, the most vulnerable spot in the formation. The wingman's job was simple: protect your leader's tail while he engaged the enemy. Stay close. Follow orders. Try not to die on your first mission. The F4F Wildcat carried 6 .50 caliber machine guns and enough ammunition for approximately 20 seconds of continuous firing. Every burst had to count. Every round had to find its target. There was no room for error when you were outnumbered, 10-1. The Marines had been fighting for Guadalcanal since August 1942. 8 months of brutal combat in the jungles and skies above the Solomon Islands. The Japanese had contested every mile, every beach, every airfield. Henderson Field, the captured Japanese airstrip that had become the heart of American air operations, was bombed almost daily. Pilots slept in foxholes and flew missions on empty stomachs. By April 1943, the tide was beginning to turn. The Japanese had lost too many ships, too many planes, too many irreplaceable pilots, but they refused to surrender the initiative. Operation IGO was their answer. 350 aircraft launched from Rabaul and the surrounding bases, the largest Japanese air operation since the war began. Swett had arrived at Guadalcanal only 2 weeks earlier. He was assigned to VMF 221, a squadron that had been nearly destroyed at the Battle of Midway. The unit had been rebuilt with new pilots, new aircraft, and new determination. They were stationed at the fighter strip on the Russell Islands, 60 miles northwest of Henderson Field, positioned to intercept incoming Japanese raids before they reached the main American base. The morning had begun with a scramble order. Coast watchers hidden throughout the Solomon Islands had spotted the incoming Japanese formations. Their radio reports gave the Marines precious minutes of warning. Get airborne. Climb to altitude. Find the enemy before they find you. Swett had never seen so many aircraft in one place. The sky seemed filled with Japanese planes. Aichi D-3 Val dive bombers in tight formation. Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters providing escort. The enemy aircraft stretched across the horizon like a swarm of locusts descending on a harvest field. The mathematics of the situation were brutal. 16 Marine Wildcats against approximately 150 Japanese aircraft. The Americans were outnumbered nearly 10-1. Standard fighter doctrine called for hit-and-run attacks against such overwhelming odds. Dive through the formation. Fire a quick burst. Escape before the escorts could respond. James Swett had a different plan. If you want to see what happened when this young Marine pilot ignored the rulebook and attacked alone, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories with more viewers. Subscribe if you're new here. Back to Swett. The Wildcat dove toward the formation of Val dive bombers. These were the priority targets. The Vals carried 550-pound bombs capable of sinking cruisers and destroyers. They were headed for the American ships anchored in the Sound below. Every Val that reached its target could mean hundreds of American sailors dead. Swett selected his first target, a Val at the rear of the formation, slightly separated from the others. He closed to 200 yards and pressed the trigger. His 6 .50 caliber machine guns roared to life. Tracers reached across the sky and found their mark. The Val exploded in a ball of orange flame and black smoke. His first kill, less than 30 seconds into his first combat mission. But there was no time to celebrate. More Vals were diving toward the ships below. Swett rolled his Wildcat and lined up on a second target. Another burst of gunfire, another explosion. The Japanese bomber spiraled into the water, leaving a trail of burning debris. 2 kills, The attack had barely begun. The Japanese escort fighters were responding now. Zero pilots spotted the lone Wildcat tearing through their bomber formation and dove to intercept. The A6M-0 was lighter and more maneuverable than the F4F. In a turning fight, the Zero would win every time. But the Wildcat was more rugged, better armed, and could dive faster than any Japanese fighter in the Pacific. Swett ignored the Zeros. He knew they were coming. He knew they would eventually catch him. But the Vals were still diving on American ships, and every second he spent evading fighters was a second the bombers had to complete their attack runs. He would deal with the Zeros later, if there was a later. A third Val appeared in his gun sight. Swett pressed the trigger and watched pieces separate from the Japanese aircraft. The pilot tried to pull out of his dive, but the damage was too severe. The Val crashed into the water short of its target. 3 kills. James Swett had become an ace in less than 2 minutes. But the accepted definition of ace required 5 kills. Swett was not satisfied. The bombers were still coming, and American sailors were still dying below. He pushed his throttle to maximum power and dove after another formation of Vals. The 4th kill came at 300 yards, a long burst that walked tracers across the Val's engine, cowling and into the cockpit. The bomber erupted in flames and fell away. The 5th kill followed seconds later. Another Val, another burst, another explosion. 5 confirmed kills in his first combat mission. James Swett had achieved ace status faster than any Marine pilot in history. Most pilots would have turned for home. 5 kills was an extraordinary achievement. His ammunition was running low. Japanese fighters were closing from every direction. The smart decision was to dive away, escape to friendly territory, and live to fight another day. Swett saw a 6th Val lining up on an American destroyer. He attacked again. The 6th Val was already in its dive when Swett's tracers found it. The Japanese pilot released his bomb a fraction of a second before his aircraft disintegrated. The bomb missed the destroyer by less than 100 feet, sending a geyser of water across the ship's deck. 6 kills. But Swett's guns were running dry. The ammunition counters showed almost empty. He had perhaps 3 seconds of firing time remaining. A 7th Val appeared directly ahead. Swett had a choice: save his remaining ammunition for defensive use against the Zeros that were surely closing in, or attack one more bomber and leave himself defenseless. He attacked. The final burst struck the Val's fuel tank. Fire erupted along the wing route and spread to the fuselage. The Japanese bomber rolled inverted and dove into the water, trailing flames and smoke. 7 confirmed kills in a single mission. 7 enemy aircraft destroyed in approximately 15 minutes of combat. James Swett had accomplished what no Marine pilot had ever done before, and what few would ever do again. His guns were empty. His fuel gauge showed the needle dropping toward reserve. Japanese fighters were everywhere, and the lone Wildcat had no means of defense except speed and maneuvering. Swett dove for the deck. The water of the Solomon Sea rushed up to meet him. He leveled off at 50 feet, using the waves to mask his escape. Zero pilots, following from above, would have difficulty tracking a gray-painted Wildcat against the gray-green water. The tactic was dangerous but effective. But the danger was not over. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from an unexpected source. American ships, their gunners trained to shoot at any low-flying aircraft, opened fire on the Wildcat, streaking toward them at wave-top height. Swett's own countrymen were shooting at him. He pulled up, waggling his wings in the recognition signal that identified him as friendly. The gunners either did not see the signal or did not care. Tracers continued to reach for his aircraft. 40mm Bofors rounds and .50 caliber machine gun fire filled the sky around him. Then he felt the impact. Something struck his aircraft with tremendous force. The Wildcat shuddered. Warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel. Oil pressure dropping. Engine temperature rising. The Pratt & Whitney radial engine that had carried him through the most extraordinary aerial combat of the Pacific War was dying. Swett had seconds to make a decision: bail out over the water and hope for rescue, or try to nurse the crippled fighter back to friendly territory. He chose the water. The engine was failing too fast for any other option. The Wildcat hit the surface of Ironbottom Sound at approximately 100 knots. The impact was brutal. The aircraft's nose dug into the water and the tail snapped up, throwing Swett forward against his harness. Seawater flooded the cockpit. The plane began sinking immediately. Swett fought his way out of the sinking aircraft. His harness release jammed. Seawater filled his nostrils. The weight of his flight gear dragged him down. For a moment, he thought the ocean was going to claim him after all, that survival through 7 kills and 2 gauntlets of enemy fighters would end in drowning within sight of the ships he had just protected. His fingers found the emergency release. The harness fell away. He kicked free of the cockpit and clawed toward the surface. Air, light, life. James Swett floated in the warm water of Ironbottom Sound, surrounded by the debris of his aircraft and the echoes of the most remarkable aerial combat debut in Marine Corps history. A destroyer spotted him within minutes. Sailors hauled the soaking pilot aboard and wrapped him in blankets. He was alive. He was uninjured, and he had just destroyed 7 Japanese aircraft in a single mission. The debriefing at the Russell Islands began within hours of Swett's rescue. Intelligence officers crowded into the small tent that served as the squadron ready room. They wanted every detail. Every angle of attack. Every burst of gunfire. Every second of the engagement that had produced results beyond anything they had seen before. Swett recounted the mission with the calm precision that would characterize his entire career. The approach, the dive, the first kill, the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh. The escape through friendly anti-aircraft fire. The water landing. The rescue. The intelligence officers exchanged glances. 7 kills in a first combat mission was extraordinary. 7 kills in 15 minutes was almost impossible. But the evidence was overwhelming. Gun camera footage confirmed several of the kills. Eyewitness reports from other pilots and ship-based observers confirmed the rest. The Navy and Marine Corps confirmed all 7 victories. James Swett had achieved in a single mission what most fighter pilots never achieved in an entire career. He had destroyed an entire formation of enemy bombers almost single-handedly. He had prevented countless American deaths by stopping those aircraft before they could release their weapons. The Medal of Honor recommendation went up the chain of command within days. Major General Roy Geiger, commanding the Marine Air Forces in the Solomons, endorsed it personally. Admiral William Halsey added his signature. The paperwork moved with unusual speed through the military bureaucracy. On October 7th, 1943, exactly 6 months after the mission that earned it, James Swett received the Medal of Honor from Admiral Chester Nimitz aboard a naval vessel in the Pacific. The citation praised his daring and courageous action and noted that his destruction of 7 enemy aircraft contributed essentially to the success of his squadron's operation and to the protection of Allied shipping. But the Medal of Honor ceremony was not the end of James Swett's war. It was barely the beginning. James Elm Swett was born on June 15, 1920, in Seattle, Washington, during the boom years that followed the First World War. His father, Frank Swett, was a businessman who moved the family to San Mateo, California, when James was still young. The Bay Area became home, and the skies above it became the young boy's obsession. Aviation was still new in the 1920s and 1930s. Charles Lindbergh had crossed the Atlantic when Swett was 7 years old. The newspapers were filled with stories of record-breaking flights and daring aviators. Young boys across America looked up at the sky and dreamed of joining them. Swett was different from most dreamers. He actually did something about it. At 16, he began taking flying lessons at local airports around the Bay Area. He paid for the lessons himself, working odd jobs after school and on weekends. The costs were significant for a teenager during the Depression years, but Swett was determined. By the time he graduated from San Mateo High School in 1938, he had already logged considerable flight time. College came next. Swett enrolled at San Mateo Junior College, continuing his education while continuing to fly. The war in Europe had begun, and young American men with aviation experience were suddenly in high demand. The military services were expanding their pilot training programs. They needed candidates who already knew how to fly. Swett enlisted in the Naval Aviation Cadet Program in 1941. His civilian flight experience gave him a significant advantage over candidates who had never touched an aircraft's controls. He moved through primary training quickly, demonstrating the natural aptitude that would later make him one of the deadliest pilots in Marine Corps history. Pearl Harbor changed everything. The Japanese attack on December 7th, 1941, transformed a peacetime training program into a desperate race to produce combat pilots. Swett and his fellow cadets found their training accelerated, their leave canceled, and their futures suddenly uncertain. They were no longer preparing for a career in military aviation. They were preparing for war. Swett received his commission as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps on April 1st, 1942. He was assigned to VMF 221, a squadron with a proud history and an uncertain future. The unit had been deployed to Midway Island, where it would face the Japanese Carrier Strike Force in June 1942. But Swett was not at Midway. The timing of his assignment meant he missed the battle that nearly destroyed his squadron. VMF 221 lost most of its pilots and aircraft defending Midway against the Japanese attack. The survivors were withdrawn to rebuild, and Swett joined them during the reformation process. The new VMF 221 was a different unit from the one that had fought at Midway. New pilots, new aircraft, new leadership. The Brewster Buffaloes that had proven so inadequate against Japanese Zeros were replaced with F4F Wildcats. The tactics were updated, the training intensified. By early 1943, VMF 221 was ready to return to combat. They deployed to the Solomon Islands in March, assigned to the fighter strip on the Russell Islands. Their mission was to provide air defense for the American forces operating in the area to intercept Japanese raids before they could reach Henderson Field and the ships supporting the Guadalcanal campaign. Swett had less than 2 weeks to acclimate to the combat environment before April 7th. The Solomon Islands in 1943 were among the most dangerous places on Earth for an aviator. The Japanese held extensive territory to the north and west, with major bases at Rabaul, Bougainville, and the Shortland Islands. American forces held Guadalcanal and the Russells, a fragile toehold in enemy-controlled waters. The air war over the Solomons had been grinding on for 8 months. Both sides had lost hundreds of aircraft and thousands of airmen. The Japanese had the advantage of numbers and proximity to their bases. The Americans had better training, better tactics, and increasingly better aircraft. The F4F Wildcat that Swett flew was not the best fighter in the Pacific. The Zero could outclimb it, outturn it, and outrange it. But the Wildcat could take punishment that would destroy a Zero, and its 6 .50 caliber machine guns could tear apart any aircraft they hit. American pilots learned to use their advantages: diving attacks, mutual support, and the rugged construction that let them absorb damage and keep flying. The living conditions on the Russell Islands were primitive. Pilots slept in tents on the edge of the jungle. They ate sea rations and occasionally fresh food when supply ships arrived. Malaria was endemic. Dysentery was common. The heat and humidity never relented. Combat missions could come at any time. Coast watchers scattered throughout the islands provided early warning of Japanese attacks, but the warning time was often measured in minutes. Pilots learned to sleep in their flight gear, ready to sprint for their aircraft at the first sound of the scramble alarm. Swett adapted to this environment quickly. His civilian flying experience had taught him self-reliance. His Marine training had taught him discipline. The combination made him an effective combat pilot from his first day on the island. April 7th, 1943, was supposed to be a routine patrol day. It became something else entirely. Operation IGO represented the Japanese High Command's attempt to regain the initiative in the Solomon Islands campaign. Admiral Yamamoto personally supervised the planning from his headquarters at Rabaul. He assembled the largest concentration of Japanese naval air power since the opening months of the war. The plan called for a series of massive strikes against American positions. The first target was the shipping concentrated around Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. Destroy the transports and supply ships, cut the American supply lines, force a withdrawal from the hard-won positions. The Japanese launched 67 Val dive bombers and 110 Zero fighters from bases throughout the region. The strike force assembled over Bougainville and headed southeast toward the American anchorage. Coast watchers tracked their progress and radioed warnings ahead. The American response was hampered by the sheer scale of the attack. Only about 76 fighters were available to intercept the incoming raid. They would be outnumbered more than 2-to-1, facing pilots who had been fighting since the war began. VMF 221 launched 12 Wildcats, later reinforced by additional aircraft. They climbed toward the incoming formations, straining to reach altitude before the Japanese arrived. Swett was flying as wingman in his division, positioned to support his leader during the engagement. What happened next defied every tactical doctrine Swett had been taught. During the approach to the Japanese formation, Swett became separated from his flight leader. Whether through combat maneuvering, radio failure, or simple confusion in the chaos of a major air battle, he found himself alone above the enemy bombers with no wingman and no support. Standard doctrine called for immediate withdrawal. A lone fighter against a protected bomber formation was suicide. The escort fighters would swarm the isolated aircraft, while the bombers continued their mission unmolested. Swett attacked anyway. His logic was simple. The bombers were diving on American ships. American sailors would die if those bombs found their targets. Every Val he destroyed was a bomb that would not explode on a destroyer's deck or a transport's hull. The escort fighters would catch him eventually. He knew that, but until they did, he would kill as many bombers as possible. The combat that followed lasted approximately 15 minutes. In that time, James Swett destroyed 7 enemy aircraft, more than most fighter pilots destroyed in entire careers. His technique was textbook fighter combat. Approach from above and behind, close to lethal range. Fire a short, accurate burst. Break away before the enemy can respond. Find another target. Repeat. The Vals were not defenseless. Each carried a rear-facing machine gun operated by the radio operator, gunner. These weapons had killed many American pilots who approached carelessly. But Swett attacked with such speed and precision that the Japanese gunners had little opportunity to respond. His first kill came at 200 yards, a perfect deflection shot that caught the Val at the junction of wing and fuselage. The fuel tank exploded, and the aircraft disappeared in a fireball. The second kill was similar. The third, the fourth. Swett moved through the formation like a predator through a herd, selecting targets, striking, moving on before the escorts could respond. By the fifth kill, the Zero pilots had identified him as the primary threat. They dove toward the lone Wildcat, their superior speed and maneuverability giving them the advantage. But Swett was already moving to his next target, using the bomber formation itself as cover, knowing the Zeros would hesitate to fire into their own aircraft. The 6th and 7th kills came in rapid succession. Swett was pushing his luck now, staying in the fight far longer than was wise. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, his fuel was dropping, and the Zeros were closing in. He dove for the water, using the Wildcat's superior dive speed to escape the pursuing fighters. The Zeros could not follow without risking structural failure. Their lighter construction, which gave them such excellent maneuverability, could not handle the stress of high-speed dives. The escape should have been clean, but the American anti-aircraft gunners had other ideas. Friendly fire has killed soldiers and aviators in every war in human history. The chaos of combat, the difficulty of identification, the reflexive response to any aircraft approaching at high speed, all of these factors contribute to tragedies that no amount of training can completely prevent. The American ships in the anchorage had been under attack for nearly an hour. Their gunners were exhausted, terrified, and primed to shoot at anything that moved. When a low-flying aircraft appeared at wave-top height, streaking toward them at high speed, they opened fire without waiting for identification. Swett was hit by American anti-aircraft fire. The rounds damaged his engine, severed oil lines, and turned his Wildcat into a gliding wreck. He had survived 7 kills against the Japanese, only to be shot down by his own countrymen. The water landing was violent, but survivable. Swett had been trained for ditching, and he executed the procedure as well as the damaged aircraft allowed. The impact was harsh enough to leave him momentarily stunned, but he recovered quickly and fought his way free of the sinking cockpit. Floating in Ironbottom Sound, so named for the dozens of ships that had sunk there during the Guadalcanal campaign. Swett had time to reflect on the morning's events. He had achieved something remarkable. He had also nearly died, twice, first from the Japanese and then from his own side. The rescue came quickly. Destroyers in the anchorage had seen his crash and dispatched boats to pick up the pilot. Within 30 minutes of hitting the water, Swett was aboard a friendly ship, wrapped in blankets, answering questions about the aircraft he had shot down. The answers amazed everyone who heard them. The Medal of Honor citation for James Swett reads, in part, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, as Division Flight Leader in Marine Fighting Squadron 221, in action against enemy Japanese aerial forces in the Solomon Islands area, the 7th of April, 1943. In a daring flight to intercept a wave of 150 Japanese planes, First Lieutenant Swett unhesitatingly hurled his 4-plane division into action against a formation of 15 enemy bombers and, personally exploding 3 hostile planes in mid-air with accurate and deadly fire during his dive, pulled out to attack the remaining hostile bombers, forming for another attack. Although separated from his division while clearing the unswept area, he boldly executed 7 individual attacks and, single-handed, destroyed a total of 7 enemy bombers, thereby depriving the enemy of nearly half of his striking force. The language is formal, restrained, characteristic of military citations. It does not convey the terror of diving alone into 150 enemy aircraft. It does not describe the sound of 50 caliber machine guns hammering in the confined cockpit. It does not mention the tracers reaching for his aircraft from every direction, or the moment when friendly fire brought him down. The Medal of Honor was presented by Admiral Chester Nimitz at a ceremony in the Pacific. Swett stood at attention while the Admiral draped the pale blue ribbon around his neck. The medal represented the nation's highest recognition of combat valor, an acknowledgement that James Swett had gone above and beyond what any reasonable standard of duty could require. But the ceremony was not the end of his war. James Swett returned to combat almost immediately after receiving the Medal of Honor. The Marine Corps needed experienced pilots, and a man who had destroyed 7 aircraft in 15 minutes was too valuable to keep on the ground. He was assigned to VMF 221 again, now flying the new F4U Corsair, a faster, more powerful aircraft than the Wildcat he had flown on April 7th. The Corsair could match the Zero in almost every performance category and exceed it in several. It was the fighter the Marines had been waiting for since the war began. Swett's subsequent combat record was impressive by any standard. Over the following months, he shot down an additional 8.5 enemy aircraft, bringing his total to 15.5 confirmed kills by the end of the war. The half-kill represented an aircraft destroyed in cooperation with another pilot, a common occurrence in the chaotic environment of Pacific air combat. But no subsequent mission matched the intensity of April 7th, 1,943. That single engagement remained the defining moment of his career, the achievement that would define his place in Marine Corps history forever. The war in the Pacific ground forward through 1,943 and 1,944. American forces advanced from island to island, capturing airfields and naval bases that brought them ever closer to the Japanese home islands. Swett participated in the campaign, flying mission after mission over enemy territory. He survived. Many did not. The casualty rate among fighter pilots in the Pacific remained horrific throughout the war. Aircraft were lost to enemy action, to mechanical failure, to simple accidents in the demanding environment of carrier and island-based operations. Pilots who survived their first few missions often grew complacent, and complacency killed as surely as Japanese bullets. Swett avoided complacency. He treated every mission as if it might be his last, maintaining the aggressive vigilance that had carried him through his first combat engagement. The lessons of April 7th never left him. The end of the war found James Swett still in the Pacific, still flying, still fighting. The atomic bombs that ended the conflict came as a relief to every American service member in the theater. The invasion of the Japanese home islands would have cost hundreds of thousands of American lives, and every pilot knew they would be in the vanguard of that assault. But Swett's military career did not end with the war. He remained in the Marine Corps, transitioning from propeller-driven fighters to the new jet aircraft that were revolutionizing military aviation. The F-4U Corsair gave way to the F-9F Panther, and eventually to the supersonic fighters that would dominate the Cold War era. Swett served in the Korean War, adding to his combat experience in a conflict that tested American military power against communist forces in Asia. He flew missions over the Korean peninsula, engaging enemy aircraft in the skies over the Yalu River, continuing the work he had begun over the Solomon Islands nearly a decade earlier. His career spanned the most dramatic period of change in aviation history. He had entered the service flying fabric-covered biplanes and retired flying jets that exceeded the speed of sound. The technology transformed completely, but the fundamentals remained the same: courage, skill, and the willingness to engage the enemy at close range. Swett retired from the Marine Corps as a colonel after more than 2 decades of service. He had risen from a young second lieutenant, fresh out of flight training, to a senior officer with responsibilities far beyond the cockpit of a fighter aircraft. But he never forgot where he had come from, or the mission that had defined his career. James Swett returned to California after his retirement from the Marine Corps. The Bay Area that had been his home as a child became his home again. He married, raised a family, and built a civilian life far removed from the jungles and airfields of the South Pacific. But the memories never faded. Veterans of the Pacific Air War formed associations and held reunions, gathering to remember fallen comrades and share stories that only fellow veterans could understand. Swett attended these events throughout his later years, connecting with men who had shared the experience of combat against the Japanese. He spoke at schools and civic organizations, sharing the history of the Pacific War with generations who had not lived through it. The young people who listened to his stories could barely comprehend a world without jet travel, without satellites, without the internet. The propeller-driven fighters and island campaigns of World War II seemed as distant as the Civil War. But Swett made the history real. He described the heat and the fear and the split-second decisions that meant life or death. He honored his fallen comrades by ensuring their sacrifices were not forgotten. The Medal of Honor Society welcomed him as a member, connecting him with the small fraternity of men who had earned the nation's highest military honor. These gatherings brought together veterans from every branch and every conflict, united by the recognition that they had gone above and beyond what duty required. Swett participated in these events with characteristic modesty. He never claimed to be a hero, never sought attention for his achievements. When asked about the Medal of Honor, he deflected credit to the men who had not survived, the pilots who had died fighting alongside him in the skies over the Solomon Islands. The modesty was genuine. Like most combat veterans, Swett understood the role of luck in survival. The bullets that missed him could just as easily have hit. The engine that failed after the anti-aircraft hit could have failed earlier. 1,000 small variations in circumstance could have left him dead in the waters of Ironbottom Sound instead of being hauled aboard a destroyer and wrapped in blankets. He had been skilled, certainly. His 7 kills in 15 minutes demonstrated ability far beyond the ordinary. But skill alone did not explain survival in the chaos of Pacific air combat. Luck played its role, and Swett never forgot it. The F4F Wildcat that James Swett flew on April 7th, 1943, lies somewhere beneath the waters of Ironbottom Sound. The aircraft sank within minutes of the water landing, carrying its gun camera footage and bullet-scarred airframe to a grave it shares with the battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft that gave the Sound its grim name. But the story of the aircraft's final mission did not sync with it. Military historians have studied Swett's engagement in detail, analyzing his tactics and decision-making. His attack on the Val Formation violated conventional wisdom about engaging protected bombers, but it succeeded because of the specific circumstances he faced. The Japanese escorts were spread too thin to protect every bomber. Swett exploited the gaps in their coverage with devastating effect. Aviation tacticians have used the engagement as a teaching example for generations of fighter pilots. The lessons include the importance of situational awareness, the value of aggressive action, and the understanding that doctrine must sometimes yield to opportunity. Swett's willingness to attack alone, against overwhelming odds, reflected a mindset that characterized the best fighter pilots of his generation. He understood that hesitation meant defeat, that the window of opportunity could close in seconds, that the cost of inaction was measured in the lives of the sailors on the ships below. The 7 valves he destroyed that morning represented approximately 40 Japanese airmen killed. More importantly, they represented 7 550-pound bombs that did not explode on American ships. The sailors who survived the day, because those bombs never arrived, could not identify their savior by name. But they owed their lives to the young Marine pilot who had thrown himself into an enemy formation 10 times the size of his own flight. James Swett died on January 18, 2009, at the age of 88. He had outlived most of his contemporaries from the Pacific War, surviving into a century that bore little resemblance to the one in which he had grown up. The farm boy from Seattle who had learned to fly in the skies over California had witnessed the entire arc of aviation history, from fabric wings to space shuttles. His funeral was held with military honors, a flag-draped casket, an honor guard, the bugler playing taps as the sun set over the Pacific. The ceremony recognized a life of service that had begun with a teenager paying for flying lessons and ended with a retired colonel being laid to rest among the generations of warriors who had defended the nation. The Medal of Honor Society issued a statement honoring his memory. Fellow recipients spoke of his courage and his modesty, his willingness to share his experience with younger generations, his commitment to honoring the fallen. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from the Marines who had served under him, the young pilots who had learned from his example how to fight and how to survive. They spoke of a leader who led by example, who never asked his men to do anything he would not do himself, who understood that leadership in combat meant being the first into the fight and the last to leave. The legacy of James Swett extends beyond his individual achievements. His 7 kills in a single engagement established a standard that few pilots have ever matched. His Medal of Honor recognized valor that went above and beyond what any reasonable standard could require. But his most enduring legacy may be the example he set for those who followed. Fighter pilots are trained to be aggressive, to seek combat, to destroy the enemy wherever they find him. But aggression alone is not enough. It must be combined with skill, judgment, and the willingness to accept risk in pursuit of mission success. Swett demonstrated all of these qualities on April 7, 1943. He saw an opportunity and seized it. He understood the stakes and accepted the risk. He fought until his guns were empty and then escaped through sheer skill and determination. The young pilots who study his engagement today fly aircraft he could barely have imagined. They launch missiles from beyond visual range and engage enemies they may never see with the naked eye. The cockpits are filled with computers, the instruments with digital displays, the skies with threats that travel at supersonic speeds, but the fundamental challenge remains the same. Close with the enemy. Destroy him before he destroys you. Protect those who depend on you for their survival. James Swett answered that challenge on a morning in April 1943. He answered it again in every subsequent mission he flew, in every engagement he fought, in every moment he spent in the skies over the Pacific. His 7 kills in 15 minutes remain among the most remarkable achievements in the history of American military aviation. His Medal of Honor recognizes that achievement and the courage that made it possible. The waters of Ironbottom Sound still hold their secrets. Dozens of ships rest on the bottom, their hulls slowly dissolving in the salt water, their stories preserved only in the memories of those who survived and the records of those who documented the battles. James Swett's Wildcat lies among them, a small addition to the graveyard of the Guadalcanal campaign. But the pilot who flew that aircraft escaped the fate that claimed so many of his contemporaries. He survived the war, survived the decades that followed, and lived to see his story become part of the permanent record of American military history. That story inspires new generations of Marines and aviators, young men and women who look up at the sky and dream of flight, just as James Swett once did. They study his tactics, his courage, his willingness to risk everything in defense of his country and his fellow service members. Some of them will face their own moments of truth, their own opportunities to demonstrate the courage that Swett displayed over the Russell Islands. They will draw strength from his example, knowing that one man, properly trained and properly motivated, can make a difference that echoes through history. The lesson of April 7th, 1943, is simple but profound. When the moment comes, when the stakes are highest, when everything depends on individual action, courage matters, skill matters. The willingness to fight, even against impossible odds, matters more than anything else. James Swett embodied that lesson. His 7 kills in 15 minutes proved it beyond any doubt. If this story moved you the way it moved us, please take a moment to hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue forgotten stories from dusty archives every single week. Stories about fighter pilots who attacked alone against impossible odds. Stories about young Marines who became legends in a single morning. Real people, real heroism, real sacrifice. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, anywhere that people remember the men who flew and fought in the Pacific. Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in the Marines or in naval aviation. Tell us if you have ever heard of James Swett before today. April 7th, 1943. The Russell Islands, Solomon Islands, one F4F Wildcat, against 150 Japanese aircraft. 15 minutes of combat. 7 confirmed kills. 1 Medal of Honor. The Wildcat of Guadalcanal earned its name that morning. James Swett earned his place in history. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure the courage of April 7th, 1943 is never forgotten.